In a small village, a preacher arrived one day. His name was Pastor Ezekiel. He said he had the power to heal the sick and even raise the dead. He promised the people that if they came to his church, their lives would be better. Some people were poor, some were sick, and some had lost hope. They listened to him and believed. Every Sunday, Pastor Ezekiel's church was full. People came with their sick children, their broken hearts, and their empty pockets. They prayed for healing, for blessings, for answers. The preacher would stand in front of them, shouting prayers, making strange signs in the air, and touching their heads. And every time, something happened. The sick were healed. The blind could see. Those who were poor found money. People believed the preacher was sent by God. But after some time, strange things began to happen. People who came to the church started acting differently. They would not speak to their neighbors, or they would leave their homes for days. The village started to feel uneasy. A man called Kojo went to the church one Sunday and didn't come back. A woman called Oma came to church, and after that, she was not the same. She would sit and stare at the walls, her eyes empty. One day, a young girl named Efua decided to follow her mother, who had been going to Pastor Ezekiel's church for weeks. Efua didn't trust the man, but she didn't know why. Her mother had become distant, like a stranger. Efua followed her mother to church, hiding in the back so Pastor Ezekiel wouldn't see her. She watched. The preacher stood at the front, his eyes shining like he was not the same man Efua had first seen. His voice was deep, like he was calling someone or something that was not from this world. When he spoke, the air around him felt heavy. Efua felt something strange in her chest, like she could not breathe. Then, Pastor Ezekiel did something no one had seen before. He raised his hands high and began to chant. The people in the church began to sway, their bodies moving with him. Their faces were blank, like they were not there anymore. It was like the preacher had taken their souls. Efua was scared. She tried to leave, but her legs were stuck. It was as if the walls of the church were pushing her back inside. She watched as the preacher walked slowly to the back of the room. He was staring at her mother. Efua's mother stood up, her eyes wide, as if in a trance, and walked to the preacher. The preacher whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, following him to the back of the church. Efua didn't know what to do. She wanted to call for help, but no one would listen. They were all lost in Pastor Ezekiel's power. She knew something dark was happening, but she couldn't figure out what. She ran out of the church, feeling the weight of the airlift as she stepped outside. For days, Efua didn't go near the church. But her curiosity kept pulling her back. Finally, she went again, this time with a plan. She had to find out what was happening. She snuck into the church at night, when it was empty. What she found made her heart race. Behind the altar, there was a hidden door. She pushed it open and stepped into a dark room. In the middle of the room was a large, ancient-looking book. She opened it and saw strange symbols written inside. It wasn't a Bible. It was something far worse. It was a book of power, a book that Pastor Ezekiel had been using to control the people. Efua's eyes widened as she realized the truth. The preacher was not a man of God. He was using dark magic to control the people in the village. He was calling spirits to do his bidding, and he was using them to bind the villagers to his will. Pastor Ezekiel wasn't healing them. He was taking their souls. Efua knew she had to do something, but she didn't know what. She ran back to her home, but her mind was spinning with fear. The next Sunday, she tried to tell everyone what she had seen, but no one believed her. The preacher had a strong hold over them. They saw him as their savior. One by one, the villagers continued to fall under his spell. Those who tried to leave the church found themselves in the same state as the others. And Ephua, no matter how hard she tried, could not save her mother or the others. Now, whenever someone talks about Pastor Ezekiel, I shiver. I know what he is capable of, and I know he is still out there, moving from village to village, spreading his darkness. If you ever hear about him, or any preacher who promises miracles, beware. There is always a price to pay. And sometimes, that price is your very soul. In a small village, a preacher named Pastor Ezekiel came one day. He was a tall man with a deep voice, and he promised the villagers miracles, healing, wealth, and blessings. People were curious and desperate for change. The poor, the sick, and those who had lost hope all gathered to hear him preach. Pastor Ezekiel told them he could heal the sick, give them riches, and even raise the dead. He said he had been sent by God to help them. The villagers listened to him. Some believed him right away, others were skeptical, but everyone was intrigued by the promises he made. The preacher built his church in the center of the village. Every Sunday, people came in large numbers, hoping for a miracle. The sick came, the poor came, and even the elders came with hopes that their lives would change. The preacher would stand in front of them, raise his hands, and shout prayers. And just like that, miracles began to happen. A woman who had been blind for years could suddenly see. A man who had been crippled walked again. The villagers were amazed. They believed Pastor Ezekiel was truly sent by God. As weeks passed, the miracles continued. People's lives seemed to be improving. The sick became healthy, the poor found money, and even children who were sick were healed. Pastor Ezekiel's church grew bigger. But something strange started to happen. The people who attended his church began to act differently. They no longer smiled at each other. They spoke less. They were distant, like something had changed inside them. One day, a man named Kojo went to church and didn't come back. His wife, Afia, searched the whole village but could not find him. A few days later, a woman named Oma stopped speaking to anyone. She would sit in her house, staring blankly at the walls. The villagers noticed that people who went to the church were not the same. They looked lost, as if they were not there anymore. But no one dared to question Pastor Ezekiel. They all believed he was a man of God. They thought whatever was happening to them was part of the miracle. Ephua, a young girl, started to notice this too. She saw how her mother was changing. Her mother, who used to be full of life and laughter, was now quiet and distant. Ephua didn't like the way the church made her mother behave. She felt something was wrong, but she didn't know what. One Sunday, Ephua decided to follow her mother to church. She had to know what was going on. She sneaked behind her, hiding in the shadows of the church. From the back, she watched as her mother, along with the others, sat in a trance-like state, staring blankly at the preacher. Pastor Ezekiel stood in front of them, his eyes glowing with intensity. He raised his hands high and spoke in a voice that sounded different, like he wasn't just a man anymore. The villagers swayed in unison, their eyes empty, as if they were no longer in control of their bodies. Ephua could feel something was wrong. She tried to leave, but as soon as she turned, she felt like she couldn't move. It was as if the church was holding her there. She watched in fear as her mother stood up, walked toward the preacher, and followed him behind the altar. Ephua ran out of the church, her heart racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it wasn't good. That night, she couldn't sleep. She had to find out the truth. Something dark was going on, but she didn't know how to stop it. The next night, Ephua sneaked into the church. She knew it was dangerous, but she had to find out what was happening. She waited until everyone had left, then she crept inside. The church was dark and quiet. Efua looked around, trying to find anything that would explain the strange changes in the villagers. Behind the altar, she noticed a small door that she had never seen before. She pushed it open slowly. Inside was a dark room with an old wooden table. On the table was a large, strange-looking book. Efua opened it carefully. The pages were filled with symbols she didn't understand. It wasn't a Bible. It was something else. Something evil. Efua's heart began to race as she realized the truth. Pastor Ezekiel wasn't a man of God. He was using dark magic to control the people in the village. The book was a source of his power. It called spirits, and with their help, he was able to make miracles happen. But the miracles came with a price. The villagers weren't being healed, they were being controlled. Their spirits were being taken by the preacher and used for his own gain. Efua knew she had to do something. She couldn't let Pastor Ezekiel continue to control the village. But she didn't know how. She had to find a way to stop him before it was too late. The villagers had already fallen too deep under his spell. It was like they could no longer think for themselves. Efua tried to tell people what she had discovered, but no one believed her. They were all too lost in their faith in the preacher. The more she tried to warn them, the more they ignored her. The church had a hold on them, a power that they didn't understand. Efua's mother was no different. She had become just like the others, quiet, distant, and lost. Efua tried to bring her back, to remind her of the woman she used to be, but it was no use. Her mother had already given her spirit to the preacher. Efua knew she couldn't save everyone. She didn't know how to stop Pastor Ezekiel. But she had to try. Efua couldn't let the preacher continue to destroy her village. She knew there was only one way to stop him. She had to break his power. She went back to the church, determined to find a way to stop him. Pastor Ezekiel was there, standing in front of the altar, with his eyes glowing even brighter than before. He smiled when he saw her. "You think you can stop me, child?" he said in a low voice. "You cannot. The spirits are with me." Efua didn't answer him. She ran to the altar, grabbed the dark book, and threw it into the fire. The flames instantly grew higher, and the room was filled with an intense heat. The preacher screamed as the fire burned the book, but it was too late. The spirits that had been following him began to vanish, their power weakening as the book burned. With a loud crash, the church shook, and the villagers who had been under the preacher's control suddenly woke up, as if they had just come out of a deep sleep. Efua ran to her mother, who was finally free from the preacher's grip. The village was saved, but Efua knew that no one would ever forget what had happened. Pastor Ezekiel was gone, but the memory of his power would remain forever.